NATO moves to Trump-proof World War plans, and D-Day for Dan Duggan extradition. Coming up on this week's Citizens Report. Welcome to the Citizens Report for the 18th of July 2024. I'm Elisa Barwick. Joining me today is Citizens Party Research Director Robert Barwick. Welcome, Robbie.
Thanks, Elisa.
And on today's show, we're going to be talking about dramatic developments on the world stage that have occurred over the last week or so since our last show.
And we've identified probably the overwhelming motive for the planned assassination of Donald Trump.
Big picture, yes. So we'll talk about that, and then we'll come back to discuss one of our own Australian citizens who is up for potentially extradition to the United States.
Yeah, we need people's help with this one because we'll give the details. We've talked about Dan Duggan before. We've got Julian Assange out finally, but look how they tortured him before that happened. David McBride's in prison, but Dan Duggan is about to be, he's already a victim of a travesty of justice, but if this extradition goes ahead, and the D-Day is next week, so we'll give you the details on that and how you can help.
Yes, so to help us get that message out and the other important news in this show, subscribe to the channel and click the notifications. We'll alert you of new material. Share it as widely as you can on social media, hit the like button, make a comment below, get the word out in any way that you can, and support us also if you're capable of doing so. You can subscribe to our Australian Alert Service where all the backup information is, and there's a donate button that you can find linked below also to support everything we're doing, all of the campaigns that we're running. And we do have a bit of an update on one of our campaigns, a very important one, because if we want to get a postal bank, we need to have post offices.
That's what it comes down to. We could have a post office bank, Elisa, that is the biggest bank in Australia overnight, working through Australia Post's 4,200 plus post offices, covering every community in the country, and we'll put up our wonderful map again. That's what it could be. And everybody knows they could go through a very close location, their local post office, and bank with a government-owned bank. And their deposits will be safe, and they get loans for small business activities and for their regional, for their communities, etc. And you can revive Australia through this kind of mechanism that the big four private banks are just not interested in, so they can get stuffed, and that's what we could have. But if Australia Post, if we don't stop what's coming down the pipe from Australia Post, look at that map, take out half the dots, and it'll be a much less effective institution. And it's terrible that it's coming to this. So we need to intervene, and the best way we've got about a week left on a petition that the Licensed Post Office Group has put up, and we really want to maximise the signatures on that.
Yeah, so this petition, and we put out a press release, which you can find the link for below, on Tuesday, the 16th of July. And it calls on Albanese, it says, calls on our supporters to demand Albanese intervene to save the post office. And that's a relevant thing because his government just issued a revised statement of expectations for Australia Post, which they do from time to time. And under the service expectations, this is what it explicitly says. It says the retail network plays a vital role in enabling access to postal and other services, particularly in regional, rural and remote Australia. The government expects that Australia Post will pay particular attention to the needs of regional, rural and remote communities in managing the network, in particular avoiding planned closures in communities where the post office is the only remaining provider of face-to-face postal and financial services. And it talks about other services including a range of important non-postal services, including financial identity and government services, etc. So this really mandates what this petition is calling for and what we're calling for more generally, that we need to keep post offices open.
Well, we do. Now, even the wording of that, though, you can see how it's a bit watered down. It's basically saying minimise post office closures. We're saying no, stop post office closures.
Yeah.
And the way to do that is our postal bank proposal fits in perfectly with that statement of expectations. The government says it wants to keep the network, what we're warning about is that if the government doesn't actually intervene, it'll wake up one day and Australia Post will say, well, there's still 4,000 postal outlets, except half of them are automatic lockers, right? Where you don't interact with anyone. A
parcel point or something,
Glenn Isherwood and I talked about this last week when we played the ad from Australia Post, where you don't even see anybody at the post office, right? It's all an automatic process. This is Australia Post conditioning people to get prepared for this. That's not good enough, right? Whereas these, Australia Post motivation for closing post offices is because they see them as an expense and they want to cut the expense. If they become the branches of a public bank, then they will be the number one revenue source for the post office.
Transforms
right?
it.
And we keep two essential services alive.
Yeah.
Now, just on the petition, Elisa, it's very important, as we said last week, stop everything right now, pause this video, go and sign, click on the link below. Now, when I say click on the link below, I read the comments, some people have trouble with this. The way YouTube works now is you've got to click on the more. There's a little bit of a blurb under this video. There's a more. There's a thing where you click for more, and you've got to expand it, and you'll see all the links for the show, right? So just make sure you do that. But when you go to sign the petition, you haven't signed it until you get a confirmation email. Now, if you haven't, a lot of people are saying they didn't get an email. If you haven't got an email, you did something wrong. See, there's a couple of things you might have done wrong. You might have inadvertently spelt your email wrong, so you've got to go back and check that, make sure you got that right. Or you may have to prove you're not a robot, and that's a pain. I know it's a pain for a robot demanding you prove you're not a robot, right? But anyway, it's worth it in terms of the overall cause. Please go through the hoops, prove you're not a robot, and then get that final email, and when you get that email, then you click confirm on the email and the petition's signed. Right, because we've got less than a week to run on this petition, and the reason we're pushing it so hard is the government will have to respond to it. So please make sure you do that now, and then we'll get on with the rest of the show.
Yes, and now the rest of the show. Now that you've done that, thank you. NATO moves to Trump-proof world war plans. Now, so last week, the 9th to 11th of July, which was just ending as we started our show a week ago, was the NATO summit, the 75th anniversary summit, which was held where it started in 75 years ago in Washington, DC. Now, and then several days later, by that weekend, the 14th of July, there was an assassination attempt, as everyone would know, against presidential candidate Donald Trump. Yes. Now, I just want to set the stage before you talk a little bit to this issue by saying that NATO, as we've pointed to in our Australian Alert lead editorial this week, did NATO miss its headline? NATO has become, it lost its mandate after the end of the Cold War and so forth, but of course, contrary to the pledges that were made and assurances to Russia, it continued to expand, and today we see it expanding into a global forum, which we're all being recruited into in this part of the world included. So NATO has a new mandate, and it has become the enforcer of the defunct global financial order. It's protecting that existing financial arrangement and security arrangement from the threat that is represented by the majority of the world, commonly known as the Global South, under the leadership of the BRICS nations and particularly of Russia and China. And so this NATO summit, and we'll go through it in a bit more detail in a moment, basically escalated to ensure that it can continue to run its permanent wars against China and Russia to keep them distracted from creating a new and successful and fair economic order and doing the kind of development plans that they want to do as envisioned by China's Belt and Road Initiative and various other ideas, to keep them suppressed, to keep them down, to keep them contained, as the language says. So that's what NATO was focused on. And then, as you said, several days later, Trump, who of course, and this is the headline, we'll put up the headline of the Washington Post, NATO leaders move to Trump-proof the alliance in Washington.
Trump-proof.
Right, and that they say in there that Trump's shadow was casting a pall over Washington's convention centre where the summit is being held. European leaders quietly wonder whether this is a goodbye to a US president who hews to a transatlantic agenda, a bipartisan constant of US foreign policy from World War II until Trump's arrival in the White House in 2017. And so it is Trump-proofing for the most immediate 4 years, locking in various initiatives that bind the country to the alliance, including defence spending commitments, etc. And it says how to handle Trump is dominating social conversations among NATO policymakers in Washington, along with the related obsession of whether Biden will drop his re-election effort.
So, Elisa, by now, you'd have to be living under a rock not to know that Donald Trump got a bullet clip his ear in Pennsylvania. We wrote in our alert service that it's pretty eerie to think that Australia's future, immediate future, could have been determined by a few centimetres, right? Because if he hadn't turned his head, he'd be dead, right? And then there's the main thing that would have changed is what we're talking about now, this NATO agenda. Now, we can't guarantee, the main thing it might have changed, we can't guarantee that, but let's just remind people about Donald Trump, but also some of the background to this. You know, Russia, you talked about Russia and China. In my view, still the war crime of the 21st century was the invasion of Iraq that killed 1 million people on deliberate lies. People in MI6 and the CIA sat down and made up lies. There's no flawed intelligence, they made it up. That's how it worked. They got clowns, sources to give them information that they could then sex up, etc. They wanted that war, right? And that set off a chain reaction. But Russia and China weren't part of that. Russia and China weren't part of the Iraq War.
No.
They opposed the Iraq War. They didn't go to war to stop the Iraq War, but they're watching the Americans and the Brits go crazy and show the world how dangerous they actually are. If you are the majority of the world, not the top little corner of Europe, you know, North America and little Australia and New Zealand, the majority of the world, the brown part of the world, the spectrum of colour in the world that, sort of sees the world in a different way. You looked at what they did and you realised these countries are damn dangerous. Look what they will talk themselves into doing. And then the worst part is in the name of some self-righteous mission of we're bringing democracy and freedom. And they're literally mass murdering people, right? So think about the tone I'm using, because that's what you normally hear, directed at China and Russia, how bad they are. No, look at the mirror, right? I'm talking about the man in the mirror, and this is how the world sees us. So what happened though? This began this chain reaction of increasing calamities committed by the Brits and Americans with our support. We're there for every single one of them. It included the Libya intervention in 2011, and then they tried to follow that immediately with the Syria intervention. The Libya intervention took the most advanced nation of Africa and turned it into a failed state and resulted in a flood of refugees into Europe, and that's changed the politics of Europe. And what happened was a bunch of people in Europe and in America started reacting to this. They reacted to the consequences. They reacted to the money, the amount of money that was being spent, and Donald Trump was one of them. People like Tucker Carlson was another one. These are not the most wonderful human beings in the world, but they just decided this is garbage, right? So I remember in 2016, Donald Trump was an unknown. We didn't know what he would do, but it was back then he started saying, hey, NATO is costing us too much money, right? What's the point of it? Why are we the world police, right? It's costing us too much money. Donald Trump, the businessman. But what he was saying was being greeted positively by statesmen around the world who'd already been saying this for a long time, people of real standing. I remember Paul Keating, who does a lot of thinking about foreign policy in Australia. But we published this week in the alert service, Malcolm Fraser, he called for the same thing Donald Trump's been calling for. It's just that Donald Trump is made to look like an extremist because American politics is so controlled, and British politics, by this NATO machine, because the NATO machine is the military enforcement of their Anglo-American financial world order, which is unpinned by the dollar, the US dollar, which is falling apart. So Trump doesn't care about that, but the whole American-British system does. And so, he had his 4 years. Frankly, he made a lot of blunders, including, because I'm still convinced he had a fair amount of sincerity about trying to do something about NATO. But what did they do? They smashed him with Russiagate. They made up a lie that Vladimir Putin controlled him. They made sure nothing was possible. And then he is susceptible because he's got an ego the size of a house, well, a mountain, you know, Jupiter. There's no containing Donald Trump's ego. He is susceptible to people sucking up to him, and he ended up employing some of the most evil people in the world. So you can't just give Trump a blank check for that. He employed Mike Pompeo. He employed John Bolton. These people are evil. They are the scum of the earth. They are Satan incarnate on the planet. These people, and Mike Pompeo is a religious nutcase to boot.
Yeah,
right?
They define permanent war.
Exactly.
That agenda.
Exactly. They want nothing more than to cause Armageddon in a war with China because they're religious Christians and they're going to be raptured out of here. They're absolute lunatics. And he employed them and gave them a platform, right? And consequently, he was able to be manipulated to not really follow through on this NATO thing. But it's 4 years later. He still has his views on NATO. They had a safe guy in the White House. They had safe Joe Biden, right? In fact, we quote Joe Biden. Joe Biden's been part of the NATO project his whole career. In the alert service here, we quote him from 1997 when NATO first expanded. Joe Biden, they brought in Poland, right? And in fact, what they did is they got British agents to go into Poland, corrupt the Polish leadership. A woman named Anne Applebaum is one of their key NATO apparatchiks from the Anglo-American side. She married into the main Polish politician who demanded Poland's membership of NATO. And this was the first expansion of NATO east against their promise not to. But they said, this is what the Poles want this. No, you went in there and you infiltrated and manipulated their politics to want this, right? Anyway, so Poland's going to join NATO. So Joe Biden goes to Warsaw in March 1997, gives a speech, and he names the conditions. And the conditions were, you're going to privatise everything. And that's literally what he said. He said, I believe that large state-owned enterprises should also be placed in the hands of private owners so they can be operated with economic rather than political interests in mind. He said business like banks, the energy sector, the state airline, the state copper producer and telecommunications monopoly will have to be privatised. This is what they were doing to Australia. But this was a NATO demand for Poland, right? Anyway, so this is Joe Biden. So he's their safe guy in the White House. But he's literally falling apart in front of our eyes. So this story, in terms of Trump's assassination, doesn't actually begin with the NATO conference a few days before. It begins the week before, where Joe Biden is facing down Donald Trump on stage, and he's blubbering, he's drooling from the mouth. He's like... And they couldn't hide it anymore.
No.
Right? Their fake project around this presidential campaign, they couldn't hide it anymore. Now, so here you got the Mr. NATO guy, and here you got Mr. I don't like NATO, but it's not just that. Trump didn't like NATO in 2016. What's different? There's an actual war. There was no war in 2016. The Ukraine war is a very specific thing. And Trump has said that the first day he's going to end it. The first day. The Trump war is NATO's main the Ukraine war is NATO's main project right now. Right? That's the whole kit and caboodle is being based on this Ukraine war. That to keep provoking Russia into more and more escalations. That's what they want. And of course, and do the same with China. But Trump's going to, so whatever Trump might do in terms of the NATO structure, he's actually said he's going to end that war. He's going to turn off the gravy train of money to all the weapons companies that's being spent in the name of that war, etc., etc. That's very, very specific. And they thought that they'll have an election where they've got Joe Biden to stop that happening. It was very clear that day they don't. And then they had the NATO summit, and Joe Biden was equally out of it. He introduced Zelensky as President Trump, right? As President Putin. There you go, I'm as bad as Joe Biden. He introduced him as President Putin. And then, what happened on Saturday in America and Pennsylvania. Now, I've had a close look at the footage of the assassination. I zoomed in on there's a ladder that went up to the roof. There's actually a NATO label on that ladder. Right, I kid you not. Right, made in NATO. No. Look. Because what you're getting, the rest we don't know. We can't state categorically what's happened. Everybody knows the story sucks. There'll be a lot of comments now below. I'm predicting, telling us what really happened. Right?
Yes.
Everybody this was an obvious failing of the Secret Service. The boss of the Secret Service has literally come out, and her excuse for not having protection on that roof was, health and safety purposes. That roof had a slope. That's actually what she said in an interview. Right, and the slope, I mean, you know, roofs can be dangerous, but my goodness, you look at that, that's not dangerous. That was her excuse. And it's just that everyone's seen the actual story of the actual assassination is just bizarre, right? And I'm just not confident that 60 years after the assassination of JFK, when not all that story's come out, that we'll probably get to the full truth about this. So you don't get lost in the weeds of what happened on the day, right? They're going to blame it on a lone assassin, a patsy. That's what they always do. The question is, what is why Donald Trump? Why would someone want to kill Donald Trump, right? And the most powerful but evil war machine in the world will stop at nothing to keep itself going. Yep. And these are the stakes.
Now, I want to give a rundown of what happened at the NATO summit, what was decided and so forth. But just to preface it, I think it was interesting what you said a few minutes earlier, that you were talking about the Iraq War, the crime of the century, and you said Russia and China opposed it, but they didn't go to war to stop it. No. Well, look, you run through the sequence from Iraq, Syria, Libya, and the other list of nations that were on the list for regime change or these little wars. Well, when it came to Ukraine, Russia did go to war to stop it.
Oh, and actually, it has to be said, Russia also did go to intervene in 2015 in Syria.
Well, that's true, yes.
And save Syria from regime change. And Donald Trump was actually in agreement generally with what Russia did. Because when he got elected, Lisa, sorry, when he got elected in 2016, I was really blown away. It was like, is this real? You know, it was a real fluke. I went back and looked at everything he said about Syria. I wanted to see if he was genuine about Syria. We didn't talk about China in those days. We talked a lot about Syria in those days, right? And I was clear from everything I looked at. He was 100% clear on Syria. And so that wasn't an actual war. Russia intervened, though, to stop that happening and stop the Americans and the Brits doing it. Now, you're right. Ukraine, though, was the red line.
Yeah.
We're going to war.
Because here was an Iraq-style war, really, from the coup, the Maidan coup, which was killing, sending into civil war the eastern side of all of Ukraine into a new permanent war on the very border of Russia, obviously designed to weaken Russia and extend NATO, and that was the last straw.
Yep.
What country would tolerate that?
Yep.
Of course. So that special military operation then that Putin launched has become the major cannon the fodder, really the propaganda fodder to demonise Putin as, the new Hitler and everything else that you hear about. And this was what was extended at this NATO anniversary summit. So they tried to basically establish a comprehensive architecture to, as we said and as other press has said, Trump-proof the Ukraine operation, to keep the arming and the funding of Ukraine, to keep it all flowing, even if Trump comes in even from a transactional standpoint to say, oh, it's costing us too much, blah, blah, blah. Even if there's not something more significant than that. So what that Trump proofing includes is the establishment of a NATO security assistance and training program for Ukraine to centralise provision of equipment and training, a pledge of long-term security assistance for Ukraine, and a new NATO-Ukraine joint analysis training and education centre which will be located in Germany. And these are all things that, as I said, lock in at least for the next 4 years, along with other congressional decisions that have been made already.
And it's taking the fig leaf off that Russia doesn't need them to take the fig leaf off. It knows it's at war with NATO, right? It's just not officially at war with NATO, but it knows it's at war with the US and NATO, and the NATO side's just not pretending.
It also set up a NATO industrial capacity expansion pledge, which is designed to integrate the military production facilities of all NATO member nations into a single coordinated activity. No doubt that will expand to include NATO partners and other groups such as the Indo-Pacific Four, which is Australia, Japan, New Zealand and South Korea, which were also part of the summit. Another addition to that list is that there's been murmurings coming out of the United Kingdom.
Before you go on, think about this. People often say, why does Australia go along with this stuff? Right? Why do both parties? Why is New Zealand going along with this stuff? Well, don't you think it's occurred to our politicians that when they see Donald Trump get a bullet fired at him, that, you know, there are smart people in our countries as well that knows what happens when you potentially cross this agenda, right? Australia is not in the tank with America because we're scared of China. We're in the tank with America because we're scared of America. They're scared of America.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's like sticking with the mafia because they're protecting you. Now, I was about to say, there's a move coming from, this is being promoted by Britain's Royal United Services Institute, which is a part of the whole NATO apparatus in general terms, the blob as they call it, where they're saying that the UK needs to take a more leading role, you know, in leading NATO, because of course if Trump comes in, you know, that could be a question mark, and including the fact that it's the UK's nuclear capability would be used as a bargaining tool.
And this is where Trump, this is Operation Manipulate Trump, right?
Yeah.
This will be a massive, this is what they did last time. It was
Yes.
the UK that took the lead, both in creating the Russiagate rubbish. There was a UK operation, the Russiagate lies, but then Boris Johnson led this charm offensive against Trump, right? And the guy's, sorry, he's not the Messiah. Most of the time he's a very naughty boy. He's a loose cannon who can shoot in the right direction sometimes though, right? And this NATO thing he's smart on. He's not a dumb person. But don't fall for the idea that he's the Messiah. And he is susceptible. King Charles will go and have tea with him, and they'll talk about their their mothers and grandmothers. They have Donald Trump's grandmother was Scottish or something, and you know all that rubbish, right?
Absolutely.
And he'll feel wonderful, and his ego will be stroked.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, he'll turn around and no one's following his NATO agenda anymore.
Yeah, no, the first time they did it, as you said, with Boris Johnson and others, they called it flooding the zone. They said we just have to come in and surround him, right? Charm him.
And Johnson's even over at the Republican National Convention that's going on as we speak. He's there, even though everybody should know by now that the number one thing Trump wants to end, the Ukraine war, it's only going because of him. This is his war.
Yeah.
He thinks this wannabe Winston Churchill, right, flabby, you know, crazy white-haired Winston Churchill, it's his baby, and this is how they actually. This is their contempt for Trump. They should know that Trump wouldn't want to have a bar of him, but they think Trump's too stupid, and it's up to Trump to prove he's not.
Yeah, because it was, of course, Boris Johnson that went to Ukraine and sabotaged the peace agreement, you know, within months.
This would have been over in a month.
Yeah. Now, the other factor, which has been put on the table, is that right at the end of the NATO summit, the USA and Germany announced deployment of the US multi-domain task force, which will be deployed in Germany from 2026 to prepare for permanent stationing of long-range missiles, including hypersonic missiles that can reach Moscow from Germany. And the Russians reacted. Russian ambassador to the US, Anatoly Antonov, said, do they really not understand in Germany that the appearance of the US missile strike capabilities on German territory means that these capabilities will end up in Russian crosshairs?
There's a TV series that started quite a few years ago now, maybe 6 or 7 years ago, the first one was called Deutschland 83, and they followed it. So I think it's a German language show. You can watch it on SBS. It's a drama. But Deutschland 83 was drama, like when the Cold War was on, Germany was the front line, right? And it was all about these missiles and the threat to Moscow, etc., and the threat from Moscow to the western side. And Germany was the front line of that. And Germany should have wanted to have nothing to do with this stuff anymore. And now they got missiles back. And the Russians have said, well, okay, you've got a target on you.
Now, that was Russia from the NATO summit. I wanted to talk about China briefly now because increasingly over the years, China's been brought into this North Atlantic Treaty Organisation as an enemy image, even though we're over here in the Pacific in this region. So it was a really explicit agenda item to extend this permanent war agenda into Asia to suppress China. This had become explicit around 2020 when the head of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, declared that with the rise of China, quote, NATO needs a more global approach, and they started talking about global NATO and various projects to set that up, including with not only military but economic cooperation. There was I wrote articles about the economic NATO that they were setting up at that time, especially with Australia, Japan, New Zealand and South Korea, this IP4, Indo-Pacific 4 de facto alliance, they called it. And by 2022, the NATO summit in Madrid had officially labelled China a challenge to NATO. Well, now, from this 2024 communique out of the NATO summit, China was declared a, quote, decisive enabler of Russia's war against Ukraine and therefore an enemy of NATO. And it was what was singled out was the No Limits Partnership that was declared around that same time of the Ukraine war starting between China and Russia, which has been updated since, which in the NATO documentation, the final report, said that this Russia-China partnership threatens to, quote, undercut and reshape the rules-based international order, which is a cause for profound concern, right? So this is what really, as we said at the outset, is the issue, that the world majority is listening to China and Russia, and they've had it with the US system, and they want something new. They want a fair and just framework. Richard Marles, who was at NATO, of course our Deputy Prime Minister and Defence Minister, he went straight to the UK afterwards. He was at a manufacturing plant in Sheffield, which was supposedly manufacturing our AUKUS subs while we speak, he said. He warned that the rules-based order is under pressure in Europe and in the Indo-Pacific, well, they call it the Indo-Pacific. He also hit the Russia-China partnership, saying that because China signed on to assist Russia in any way, the war in Ukraine therefore is shaping the Indo-Pacific, and that's the justification of why we all have to jump in on the NATO coattails to help that war, permanent war agenda.
There's so many things to comment on there. Let's do the nomenclature first. Indo-Pacific. Last week, Modi visited Putin and gave him a big hug. Expect to hear that term Indo-Pacific change back to Asia-Pacific soon. Because Indo-Pacific was only ever part of the Anglo-American charm offensive to India to try and draw India into the gang against Russia and China, right? India doesn't play that game. There are idiots in India, don't get me wrong, but there are also smart people in India, and India does not play that game.
They don't align in that way.
They don't align like that. So India's on the nose now, and actually I've noticed, Elisa, you're starting to see some quite negative Indian-related stories, including about India in Australia, right? All because there's now, the charm offensive is now ended, right? When the charm offensive was on, India could do no wrong. Now you're going to see the negative stuff, because that's exactly what they did with China to create a public perception about China. On another person who's made the same point on the language of Indo-Pacific is the former New Zealand Prime Minister Helen Clark. She talked about, in a recent speech she gave, how every government department is now related to the Five Eyes, right? And this is similar to what you're talking about there, where they just surround everything to put it on this military outlook. So even economics departments, she was talking about economics departments, health departments, what do they have to do with the Five Eyes intelligence sharing operation? But what it does, it puts all our countries on a war footing, because New Zealand, the most proudly pacifist and independent of nations, right, has been drawn into this again now under the new Prime Minister Lux, and there's a big backlash in New Zealand about that. And Miles, he said, I saw him on TV saying, a decisive victory in Ukraine is crucial for Australia's national interest. How? Just shut these people up, stick a dummy in their mouth, and then pull it out and say, now explain back up what you said. Don't give us a soundbite. How does whether Russia or Ukraine win determine what happens in Australia? Just tell us how. What they're doing by targeting China on this stuff, though, and it's supreme hypocrisy, but it's not even true. So compare China's supposed support for Russia's war with America's support for Israel's war in Gaza. America's providing the bombs, the 500-kilo bombs that they're dropping on tents full of women and kids, another 90 killed a day or so ago, right? America's providing the bombs. What America does is, when it starts to make these accusations, it looks for anything that could be dual use. And everything can be dual use, right? I probably couldn't, but some special forces guy could probably kill me with these glasses, right? Everything could be dual use. So then they say, oh look, because China, is the industrial engine of the world, everything relies on Chinese manufacturing, right? Every member of NATO, by the way, would have China as its number one trading partner, right? For manufactured goods. Then they're saying, Russia's using Chinese manufactured goods, that's China supporting the Russian war effort. And that's our excuse.
Yeah, we would be.
That's our excuse. it's used for escalating against China, right? That is the kind of mentality, and it's just a pack of lies. Now, that said, I want to talk about something else that actually, this is very shocking. We discussed this last week, but if you want to see why are we talking about NATO, well, if you want to see, it's useful this NATO conversations come up because that's the only explanation for what happened in Melbourne last Friday. Because what happened in Melbourne last Friday is an actual Nazi apologist, a literal, undisguised Nazi apologist, a man who spent his whole career hero worshipping and promoting a person that the Jewish press, until the Ukraine invasion, the Jewish press used to regularly call a Nazi collaborator responsible for the deaths of thousands of Poles and Jews in World War II. The man we gave a state funeral to last Friday, Stefan Romaniev, was the head of the organisation of Ukrainian nationalist Bandera, who has spent his whole life glorifying this guy Bandera, Stepan Bandera, right? And he got a state funeral because he was big in the multicultural community. Yesterday, of course, was the 10th anniversary of things like of MH17 being downed over Ukraine, which of course was blamed on Russia, from an investigation run by NATO countries. So it was always going to blame Russia, right? This Stefan Romaniev became a more prominent person in Australian politics from that time onwards, right? As the leader of the Australian Federation of Ukrainian Organisations. But that's what he is, an actual, literal Nazi, avowed Nazi apologist, right, for a Nazi collaborator responsible for the deaths of Poles and Jews. So we talked about this last week. They gave him a state funeral. You'll see, we'll run some of this footage on the screen, but we'll start with this bit, because I want to start with who was there. And this was from right at the end. And so if you see what's playing now, on the right-hand side there are some very prominent politicians. You had, like you can't see them all in the photo, but I'll point out some in the photo. But for instance, the kind of people that were there was Jacinta Allen, the Premier of Victoria, Jeff Kennett, the former Premier, Steve Bracks, the former Premier. You had Bill Shorten, the member for Maribyrnong, the former opposition leader. You had Tony Abbott, the former Prime Minister of Australia, was there, right? And and then Ted Baillieu, the former Premier. So if you look closely, you might be able to recognise some of those people. Ted Baillieu is the tall guy right in the middle of that front row at the on the right hand side of the picture there. Tony Abbott is to Ted Baillieu's left. Steve Bracks is to his right. But what I want you to notice is the man using the phone with the white hair close to the bottom of the screen with the black frame glasses. That's Michael Danby, the former Labor member for Melbourne Ports. And just a few people away from him is David Southwick, the current Deputy Opposition Leader of Victoria. The reason I'm singling those two guys out, Elisa, is they're both Jewish. These are probably two of the most prominent Jewish politicians in Australia, and they were at the funeral of an actual, avowed, literal Nazi apologist for a Nazi collaborator who killed thousands of Poles and Jews. How to explain this?
Yeah.
Right? Well, there's only one explanation, and that is because these guys are fully committed to this Anglo-American centric, unipolar, NATO-enforced world order. That's who they are. And right now, people like David Southwick and Michael Danby are attacking anybody who criticises Israel's conduct in Gaza. They throw smears at them of being anti-Semitic. Michael Danby is the politician who smeared us originally as anti-Semitic 30 years ago. If you look up Citizens Party on Wikipedia, he wrote our entry, and we've never been able to change it. You can actually go to the history, for those who know Wikipedia, go to the history of the edits, and you will see how often he has combated any attempt to change the edits, personally in his own name, Michael Danby, right? He has used weaponised anti-Semitism and the memory of the Holocaust as a weapon to shut down anyone who criticises Israel or even criticises American foreign policy for that matter. And he is prepared to not just attend but honour an actual, literal, avowed Nazi sympathiser, apologist, Stefan Romaniev.
I mean, that a journalist would ask him,
put
this to him and say, how, why?
And just to prove it wasn't, like, there's no excuse. I don't know what the people there know about Romaniev, but I know Danby would know everything about him. Danby would know what he was doing there. Danby is quite a sophisticated political operative. He's on the board of international organisations dedicated to things like promoting the NATO cause, like the Henry Jackson Society in the United Kingdom. And then they let it all hang out because they showed all these people at the funeral. So if you put up, we'll play some of the footage here. You'll see it in the background. But the guy with the blue suit, they actually introduced him. The screen, the Victorian government's own live stream introduced Ole sorry, I can't pronounce the name. Medunstya is the current leader of the Organisation of Ukrainian Nationalists that Stefan Romaniev was the chairman of for 13 years, from 2009 to 2022. This is his successor. He came from Ukraine for this funeral. He's a Ukrainian far right-wing Nazi politician, right? That's what he is in Ukraine. And he gets to speak, and he spoke all in Ukrainian, so he might have said Heil Hitler for anyone knew. No one would have been able to follow it. The next guy in the Boy Scout uniform is an Australian Ukrainian like Romaniev. That's Peter Duma, and that uniform is the uniform of the what they call the Ukrainian Youth Association. Its initials are CYM. The Ukrainian Youth Association is known as some people call it the Bandera Youth. The anti-Nazi Ukrainians in Australia call it the Hitler Youth, and it has an unbroken history going back to the Nazi era. This Ukrainian Youth Association, and then the next guy is Yaroslav Duma, his brother, who was Stefan Romaniev's best friend. He's their father is a Nazi Waffen SS veteran. Their father fought in the Nazi Waffen SS for Hitler against Russians and Ukrainians and Poles and Jews in World War II, right? So they're all there. Danby would have known all of this, and then they did this photo montage. I'm going to pull out. We'll just put these ones up on the screen. I just want to because they went for too long. But the first photo you see there is Romaniev on the left at the Euromaidan protest in 2014, which was the way the Americans ran the coup that brought in the Nazis into power in Ukraine. The guy in the middle in the yellow scarf, that is Andrei Parabai, who was one of the leading fascist politicians in Ukraine, who was known as the commandant of the Maidan at the time, right? And of course, this did start as a peaceful protest, so they brought in all these Nazis to turn it into a violent protest that then took down the government. The next photo there, that's actually Romaniev where he's wearing the blue tie. That's actually a photo of him in Munich at Stepan Bandera's grave. Now, Bandera is the guy that massacred his organisation, the Ukrainian insurgent army, who massacred all these Poles and Jews in World War II. So he's at the grave, but the grave is to his left, or in the picture, to his right. It's very interesting to me they chose a picture for the montage that didn't show the grave. Because if they showed the grave, people would know, well, hang on, that's Stepan Bandera's grave. But that's the photo that was used at the funeral. And then the other one there is the group photo, and you can see Romaniev in the yellow tie. And these on the left-hand side, people like his successor at the OUNB and his best mate there next to him. That's at the anti-imperial bloc of nations in Lithuania, and he was coming back from Lithuania when he died of a heart attack. This was at the anti-imperial bloc of nations, which is that they've just refounded as an anti-Russia thing in Eastern Europe. But it's actually a revival of something that literally the Nazis started in World War II called the anti-Bolshevik bloc of nations, because when the Nazis were retreating from Russia, they wanted to stop the Russians chasing them, the Soviets chasing them, so they set up this thing called the anti-Bolshevik bloc of nations, involving Lithuania and the Baltic states and Ukraine and whatever. And it was led by the long-standing leader of Romaniev's organisation, this guy named Yaroslav Stetsko. It was taken over by the CIA after the war and kept going for decades, right? And then it eventually disbanded. They've revived that. They've revived the Nazi-founded organisation. Those pictures were on display at the funeral. Michael Danby is sophisticated enough to know all that, right? But he's there, a prominent Jewish political figure in Australia is there honouring a Nazi because that's the agenda now that they're all serving, which is the NATO agenda. That's NATO's power in Australia for you.
Yeah, but according to that to their own logic, everyone that was at that funeral should now be tarred with the anti-Semitic brush. But instead of that...
And speaking of, exactly, so they're not anti-Semitic. Michael Danby's not a self-hating Jew, which is what they like to say. But instead, we'll do some more on this in the future, but the other thing people need to know is that the people in the leaders of the pro-Israel Zionist organisations in Australia, so these are people that hold themselves up as leaders of the Jewish community, though they do not speak for all the Jewish community at all. But the Zionist Federation in Australia, and Jeremy Liebler, who's the head of that, they have now targeted one of Australia's most prominent journalists, Mary Kostakidis. They're taking her to the Australian Human Rights Commission under 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act for supposedly inciting racial hatred against Jews because of her commentary about the war in Gaza. And what they're doing is they're losing the argument, they're losing public opinion. Public opinion is public opinion on October 7th, October 8th was probably with them. But public opinion within a few months, didn't take long, but public opinion within a few months was no longer with them because nothing justified the ferocity of what we've seen. There's just massacres every week of and it's really difficult. Like if you actually expose yourself to all the footage, it's hard. You can't handle it, right? It's just absolutely awful. Mary Kostakidis has tried to use her position. She was a big champion of Julian Assange. She's tried to use her position to get some attention on that. And they're trying to shut her down using legal means. And the funny thing is the Australian newspaper and Tony Abbott led the fight to try and water down 18C on free speech grounds when Tony Abbott was Prime Minister, right? Now that it's being targeted against someone trying to defend Palestinians, they're cheering it in. Right, and so this is just a heavy-handed attempt to use legal means to crush free speech because they're losing the argument and they're losing public opinion.
Yes, I think we've probably covered that topic sufficiently. So we have 10 minutes or so for our final segment on D-Day for Dan Duggan extradition. Okay, so next week, as you mentioned, there comes a break point in Dan Duggan's case. Can you explain the details?
Next week, his team submits their main written defence to the Attorney General. And it comes down to the Attorney General, Mark Dreyfus, making a determination about whether he's going to approve Dan Duggan's extradition or not.
Now, just for viewers who are new, just recap on the case.
Dan Duggan is an Australian citizen, but he's an American, a former American Navy Top Gun pilot, who the Americans got the Australian government to arrest him in 2022 on an extradition request because he trained Chinese pilots in South Africa back in 2012, and they said he's basically training the enemy. Except the whole story is wrong. And the last time we talked about this a month or so ago before the trial. Which cleared the way for his extradition, frankly. It's now, the trial said that the courts can't stop it, it's up to the Attorney General. The last time we talked about that, news had just come out, Dan Duggan had revealed himself that, in fact, the more likely reason they're going after him has nothing to do with him training Chinese pilots in South Africa, but because they asked him to spy for them in China. And when he was in China, the whole relationship went very, very sour. Right, and so he's being targeted for that because otherwise nothing to do with South Africa makes sense. He's the only pilot who's been arrested for the pilot training in South Africa. There was a bunch of British pilots were there as well. He only did one short stint. The Americans are trying to claim that they're only targeting him because he's an American citizen, except he became an Australian citizen that same year. And the part that we tried to make people understand from the beginning, Elisa, is when you hear that Dan Duggan trained Chinese pilots in South Africa, don't think in terms of the political context of 2022, 2023, 2024, where everyone's talking about war with China. Think about 2012, where it was very, very different. So I want to play a clip because it involved a lot of British pilots as well. And the British pilots, the government eventually had to come out last year and say, well, actually, they didn't break any law. The Americans are saying something different about Dan Duggan, but they're saying, look, he didn't break any law. And so the British pilots are in the clear. And the British have subsequently passed a law to stop them from doing this kind of training. But when this came up in the Parliament in 2023, February 2023, there was a hearing, And the Air Chief Marshal Wigston testified at that hearing. He was asked about this pilot training of Chinese pilots in South Africa. Listen to what he says.
It has been going on for many years, and it goes back to a period when we took a different approach to China. We took a much more engaging approach. We did training. It was formal. We had state visits. The Red Arrows went and displayed in China in 2016, yep. And so for those people that went and became contractors, helping in simulators, helping with flying training at that stage, I can understand why they would have felt that it was a reasonable thing to do.
And that's the point. Everyone was friends with China. No one was talking about war with China in 2012, right? The China war stuff didn't come in until it actually preceded Trump. It did precede Trump. It's not just Trump. And it's one of those things that I don't think it really was Trump. It was these other guys that he brought in, like Mike Pompeo. They came in to get a war going with China, and Trump's too busy having Twitter fights with Hollywood celebrities to pay attention to what they were doing, right? He did a deal with China. He was happy. He had Xi Jinping at Mar-a-Lago. Trump's a businessman. He likes doing deals. While he was doing deals, he let people do some pretty nasty stuff. But that was the reality. There was no talk about war. So Dan Duggan goes to South Africa and he's training pilots that were cleared by the South African government. They did the vetting, right? And they cleared these pilots. Now, the pilots all come from one particular establishment in China, a company or an organisation which has the word establishment in its name. I can't remember off the top of my head. That establishment sends out Chinese pilots all over the world for training because China's living standards are rising so fast that the Chinese airline industry is just zooming, right? It's soaring, and they need pilots. So they've been getting everyone they can possibly to train them. He was training test pilots in South Africa because pilots who can train other pilots, right? That's what he was doing because he's sophisticated. But they're getting lots of training. The number one place that trains Chinese pilots in the world is America. From the same place that they're saying Dan Duggan trained military pilots because that place does both military and civilian. Well, that applies to America as well. And so it's absolutely clear that this targeting of Dan Duggan over South Africa has nothing to do with what they want him for. But if that's the only thing they could find to create a legal pretext to get him, then Australia can't tolerate that. It's not up to us to do the Americans' dirty work for them, right? Mark Dreyfus, Michael Danby's mate Mark Dreyfus, by the way, Mark Dreyfus has to do the right thing and uphold Australian law. He didn't break any laws. We've just got Julian Assange back, and look how popular that was, the Australian people, because he didn't break any Australian laws either. He's not an American citizen. Stupid Americans call Julian Assange a traitor. He's not an American, mate. Yep. He's not one of yours to be a traitor. Get out of your head that you rule the world, right? The same applies to Dan Duggan. Now, I talked to the Dan Duggan team, and not just his family, but the team. I have, as far as I can, I have a fair amount of confidence in the integrity of this family and Dan Duggan. The immediately worst part of this case is that this is just an extradition case for a guy who's never broken a law before. They could have him under house arrest with an ankle bracelet or something, right? Instead, they've put him in hell in prison, most of it through solitary confinement, away from his family. They have to go through all sorts of hoops to even see him. It's terrible. They took away his house. He had or his wife's house actually. They had a property in the southern part of New South Wales there somewhere. They were going to sell for well over $1 million to fund his legal defence. So the Americans got in first and got that frozen so he couldn't sell that, right? Even though the proceeds of crime, that the excuse they used, that most he got paid, $180,000. The house is worth a lot more than that. So they took that away, and the Australian government and the courts have accommodated this every step of the way, and they're just trying to crush him. So what the Duggan family need, though, is a lot of support. They've already had to line up lawyers in America. You can have very little confidence that Mark Dreyfus will make the right decision. So we'll put a link below. If you can help the family out in terms of donating to their legal fund, please do. They need all the help in the world. And I think the way to look at it is this is an Australian family, husband and wife and 6 kids who are being victimised just because very evil people committed to war who would assassinate a president. Don't think twice about crushing an Australian family so they can add to their narrative to justify their war agenda. And he's definitely a victim of that. Absolutely a victim of that. Under the current climate, he wouldn't get a fair trial anyway because of all the anti-China hysteria. But you've got to cast your mind back, take seriously what the Air Chief Marshal said, cast your mind back to 2012. None of that applied. He was just doing his job as a private person, right? And now he's being scapegoated for it. So Australia, he's not going to get help from the government. He can only get help from his fellow Australians, and he is one of us now, right? So, and his family's definitely they're Australians as well. Chip in, help out, and let's try and get some fairness for these guys.
Yeah, no, that's right, and join our fight against this, because what you find is that virtually any issue you look at, as you've just demonstrated in this case of this particular issue, can be traced back to the broader global picture of the fight we're in to save all of our nations. And that requires a new framework where nations can operate bilaterally, one-on-one and in multilateral fora, rather than being subject to the designs of NATO or an Anglo-American.
Exactly, and as Australians, we need to say to our American friends, look, we've been your most loyal friends and allies, but you trying to maintain a unipolar world order that just enshrines the power of the most corrupt banks in London and Wall Street over the rest of the world isn't worth dying for. We accept a multipolar world, accept that countries like Russia and China, which are ancient civilizations much older than you, buddy, right, are going to have their own views, their own interests, but accept the fact that they actually want to get on with the rest of the world, right? They just don't want you telling them what to do. And that has to end, or else we're all going to go down in flames. That's what Australia should be doing, is asserting an independent foreign policy.
That's what Malcolm Fraser, as you can read in this alert service, you can contact us for a copy, was convinced we could do, that Australia could play a key role in diffusing the whole war drive globally. Now you can also find out below, we've got meetings coming up in Newcastle on the 4th of August, our series of forums, and then Darwin, Launceston, Adelaide, so stay tuned for that. Follow the links to join us and assist in some capacity. So that's the show for this week. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks, Robbie.
Thanks, Elisa.
And see you again next week.
Authorised by Robert Barwick, Citizens Party, Melbourne.